we're now taking a look at Dune from a communist perspective. And we've got with us Jackson Mann from the US. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on Dune. I've seen bits of the films, bit of a drag, but nice enough, entertaining science fiction. But I am interested because I saw Jackson has written an article for his magazine Cosmonaut in the US about the Dune from a communist perspective. And the bits I saw were all about, a chosen savior, Paul, the Messiah. He's the one. And basically, it's up to him to liberate everybody, which is kind of the opposite of what communism is about. So, Jackson, what can we actually, as communists, learn and take away from Dune?
Um, I had a whole presentation, but I think I'm just gonna emphasize because
Sorry.
no, you're good because you're like putting me in the middle of what my presentation would be. So I think it might make sense to just talk a little bit about it kind of on the fly, as opposed to giving you all the sort of background of the created world and all that nonsense. So yeah, I mean Dune, I'm sure that many people who are listening have read this book. It's a classic sort of speculative fiction book, science fiction from 1965. It was written by Frank Herbert, who until that point was relatively unknown. He was kind of he was a journalist, mostly for local news outlets, different parts of the West Coast, mostly lived on the West Coast for most of his life of the United States. But yeah, it was his breakout hit. It led to a sort of 6-book series that was incredibly famous. His son then went on to write like something like 50 more of these books. So there's a lot of them. So my analysis of Dune really kind of brackets the first novel. It doesn't really make sense if you continue to read the rest of the books, what I have to say about the first book. As Tina was saying, like the book is quite reactionary on its face. It's an unbelievably reactionary work. It's very, very homophobic. It's incredibly misogynistic. The sort of level of Orientalism that is present in the book, I would describe as tiresome. It is incredibly difficult to read because of how Orientalist, in an almost like comical way, the book is. And then I think even underneath all of those sort of like aspects of it that are just reactionary on their face, the book really is a book for the ruling class. It's a book about educating people how to rule. And so it has a lot in common with opera seria. So for those who might not know, opera seria is basically a catch-all sort of periodization term that's used in historical musicology to refer to opera, sort of pre-French Revolutionary opera. So before the French Revolution, most operatic productions were kind of oriented around much more of a sort of court-based sort of circuit of theaters. And so obviously the thematic sort of quality of these operas was very much oriented towards the ruling class, the people who would be in these theaters. And many of the themes were about sort of like good governance, teaching sort of young nobles, like very didactic, sort of elite didacticism, teaching young nobles how to rule effectively. And on the surface, the first Dune novel that's basically what it's about. It's about teaching sort of young nobility how to rule. It does this in a number of ways. One of the sort of primary scenes that I often refer to with regard to this aspect of the novel is in the center of the book. There's sort of 2 back-to-back scenes in which the primary protagonist, Paul, who's this sort of hero figure that Tina mentioned, is kind of like contrasted with the character that the narrative is slowly setting up to be his rival. And this is that character's name is Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, who's from like an opposing noble house. So in these 2 back-to-back scenes, both of the characters are put into situations where they need to sort of fight another person to prove their sort of ability to rule. And in both cases, they kill their opponent. But in the first scene featuring Paul, his sort of emotional reaction to the killing of his opponent is one of like deep regret He like very openly like sort of weeps about the death of this person. Even during the fight, he's very resistant. He asks the person to yield. And he only kills his combatant after he's told that he has to, because in the sort of desert culture that he's found himself in, and if you've read the book, there's a lot of background to this, but in the desert culture that he's found himself in because he escaped from the Harkonnens killing his family or whatever, it's like he had basically culturally he's expected to kill a combatant who's failed. So he has to. But again, he does it with all this sort of restraint. And he ends up sort of getting like he ends up receiving the respect of the other members of this group of people, the Fremen, who are these sort of indigenous people of the planet that he's on, because he's shown so much restraint about having to kill this one of his subjects, quote unquote. Um, in the second scene that features the rival character, Feyd-Rautha, Feyd-Rautha is just like totally excessive, extremely. He's unbelievably violent to his subjects. He just kills them on a whim in incredibly horrific ways. He uses their deaths in these very like devious ways to make himself look better. And so these two scenes back to back where we're shown sort of the heroic sort of protagonist and the main villain sort of in the same sort of circumstances, but reacting in very, very different ways to those circumstances. It's sort of probably the most explicit instance of how Dune is supposed to be teaching young nobles like the appropriate sort of way that they should be interacting with their subjects. But there's a number of scenes throughout the book that do this. That's just sort of the central one. It also focuses a lot on the development of sort of ruling class consciousness. So there's many, many scenes throughout Dune in which sort of different characters who are of the ruling class, or of the sort of administrative classes that run this sort of, intergalactic civilization that exists in this sci-fi world. There are many scenes in which these different characters sort of come to mutually recognize one another as rulers, as like fellow members of the ruling class. And there is one scene in particular that is very intense with regard to this, where the sort of one of the main villains of the book, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, he has captured his sort of nemesis, who's one of the protagonists, the father of the main protagonist, Duke Leto. He's captured Duke Leto, and he means to execute him. But there's a brief moment in which you see the sort of inner thoughts of the Baron, where he doesn't want to do it. I think the exact quote is, he was, quote, reluctant to subject another noble person to so much pain, end quote. I think that's almost the exact quote. And so that scene is this very intense moment in which it's revealed to us that actually even the sort of one of the villainous characters of this story is reluctant to kill his rival as a result of his sort of his subjectivity as a part of the ruling class. And so the novel is very much a book for the ruling class on its face. But there are certain sort of aspects of the way in which the book sort of frames the sociality of the ruling class that I do think are very interesting for socialists. Um, these are mostly the result of this sort of social nihilism of the author. So Frank Herbert was very, very nihilistic. He had a very, very poor view of humanity. He tended to see ruling classes in a very negative light, even if he also did not see sort of subaltern subjects as any better. So he was very, very socially nihilistic. But because of that, the sort of ruling class of Dune's world ends up being sort of not necessarily positive, even though they are the protagonists of the book. So the way in which I think that this is registered throughout the book, and some of you may know this, but in Dune, all of the sort of ruling class characters, the sort of imperial administrators of this big space galactic empire, they all have superpowers. They all have these sort of superhuman powers, many of which are said to be the result of something called spice melange. So this is this sort of psychoactive drug that comes from the planet that most of the story takes place on, that that all these sort of characters in the created world believe give you elongated life and like these kind of superhuman powers and psychic abilities and prescience and all this stuff. So all the sort of ruling class characters, we're told as a reader, have these sort of superhuman abilities as a result of the spice. There's some eugenic arguments for why they have them, all different sorts of arguments for why they have them. Now, one of the main super sort of human abilities that many of the characters in the book have is this thing called the voice. So this is the ability to basically psychically bend the will of others using your voice alone. The main organization in the sort of created world that makes use of this power is the Bene Gesserit. So this is like a sororal sort of order of noble women who train themselves to be able to do this, to sort of bend the will of others. And so, yeah, we're told that these powers exist over and over. And in the films, all the screen adaptations, and in the later books, this is why I was saying earlier that this really only works if you're talking about the first book. These powers are pretty much unambiguous. Like, all the characters really do have superpowers. They all have these superhuman powers, and it's real. But if you just read the first book, you'll notice that in the first novel, it's not actually clear that these powers exist. It's not clear that they're real. Almost all of the sort of explicit representations of the uses of these powers are very ambiguous what's actually happening. So the one scene that I often point out with regard to this that I think is a very good example is a very, very famous scene in which Paul, the main character, and his mother, Jessica, both of whom have survived the attack on their planet that like starts much of the story, both try to use this power to escape some soldiers who have taken control of them. So in the movies, this is always represented as just like a totally unambiguous use of like a psychic power or like a superpower. But in the books, it's like not clear that that's what actually happens. So in the movies, every time I've seen now there's 3 screen adaptations of this that I've seen, this scene, and every single one, basically Jessica, the mother of the protagonist, uses this power, the voice, to order one of the soldiers that has captured them to kill another soldier. And she uses the power, and the soldier does it, and they kill each other, and they escape. In the book, what actually happens is very, very strange. So they capture the 2 soldiers, they capture Paul and Jessica, and they bring them onto this like ship that they're gonna take them out into the desert and leave them there to die. So as they're traveling on the ship, they gag Jessica because both the soldiers know that Jessica has this power, or they're aware that she has this power, or has claimed to have this power. But they don't gag Paul, the sort of protagonist. So they're traveling out into the desert, and the 2 soldiers start talking about that they want to rape Jessica before they leave these 2 characters in the desert. This sort of shocks Paul. He begins to like he begins to sort of get really nervous, and he tries to use the voice on the soldiers to get them to undo Jessica's gag so that she can use her even more developed powers to get them to kill each other. Now, Jessica in the book says, she's talking to herself, she says, "Oh, that was a perfect use of the voice." But the soldiers don't listen to him. The soldiers actually don't react to his use of the voice, which is very strange, right? If this power was real and he used it perfectly, why would they not react? They actually have like a short conversation about what they should do, whether they should undo her gag before they rape her. And so they decide to do it. So they do go undo her gag, but it's not because Paul told them to or used this power to force them to do it. They do it kind of of their own accord. And then all of the films have Jessica order one soldier to kill the other soldier. That's not what happens in the book. In fact, what happens is that Jessica, once she doesn't have a gag anymore, she says, I think it's something like, quote, "There's no need to fight over me." That's what she says. And that suddenly changes the attitude of the 2 soldiers because they're sort of like hyped up because they've just been in this battle. They're kind of like really, really intense and emotional. They suddenly think that they're going to have to fight over Jessica, and they end up fighting over who gets to rape her first. which leads them to attack each other and kill each other kind of accidentally. And so this isn't Jessica using a like superhuman power to get them to kill each other. She's actually just using the power of suggestion. So it's really and this is just like a particular scene, but this is almost every demonstration of these powers is very ambiguous like this. It's like it's not clear that these powers are actually happening.
Can I ask you something, Jackson? Because it's your on your Cosmonaut article, you describe that a lot of the left in America were trying to put a socialist spin on the film, or almost like, you know, see that say there's something that it's you know, it shows revolution, it shows all sorts of positive things for the working class, etc. And I really struggled with that. Why do you think they try to do that?
No, I mean, I think my article was a reaction to many articles that were circulating in, as you said, circulating in the US left that were like, oh, this is a great book because it's like a book about the working class or something, or it's about ecology. And I mean, that's just not true. I mean, this book is very reactionary. And what I was interested in doing was like, well, people are interested enough in this book to really want to make it something that it doesn't seem to be on the surface. So maybe there is something there. And so I started thinking about this book. And what I ended up kind of, as I was sort of rereading it a number of times, I was like, oh, there is something interesting in this book. But it's not like the sort of stuff that they're saying. It's the way in which the book sort of like shows how the ruling class develops its own ideology of itself. Like that there's a lot in the book because because Frank Herbert as an author was kind of socially nihilistic. Even though the book is about the ruling class, it's not necessarily positive about them. And it ends up sort of actually containing a number of interesting scenes where you witness how the ruling class develops a sort of ideology of its own social role and what it is. And a lot of these powers, I think, are, especially in the first book, are good instances of this where how do we understand the way the ruling class thinks about itself? How do we understand the way the ruling class develops an ideology of its own social role and like why it's in that social role? And there are a number of scenes that do this very well, where because of their ambiguity about the reality of these superpowers that all these ruling class people have, you can kind of like begin to sort of extract a kind of a theory of the sort of sociality of the ruling class and how they develop their own sort of like ideology. I don't
It
know
was
if that
also
makes any sense.
what was also interesting, I mean, it does touch on the film version anyway, things of like climate change and, you know, that desert planet. There were plans to make it into a green planet and make it properly habitable, and then it wasn't profitable. So there are references to, you know, the profit motive. I think one of the really bad guys, he you know, he couldn't float. I don't know his name. He floats in the air, but he goes like, you know, it's about the profit and just extract or something, you know, along those lines. So they're trying to get spice out of that planet, and they basically left it in ruins because it's all about the profit margin. So there's a bit of something there for Marxists, perhaps.
I mean, I think what I say in my original article is that I don't feel that stuff is interesting enough to make it worthwhile for communists, because there just is like there's a long history of this kind of stuff in speculative fiction. Like there's like why Dune? Why Dune? There's like so much speculative fiction that deals with these same problems of ecology, that deals with the political economy in more interesting ways. Um, why this sort of why this book that's actually quite reactionary? Um, and for me, that the answer to that question was, well, why? Well, it has this one aspect that actually is interesting about like how the ruling class understands itself. Because for me, yeah, just the questions of ecology and political economy in Dune are just not that interesting, especially considering the fact that there's all these setbacks for it.
It does feel a bit tacked on, but you know, I mean, it is a, as you said, it's been read millions of times, and you do come across quite a lot of lefties who seem to love it, and I always struggled with understanding that. Thank you very much, Jackson. It was a very interesting discussion.